Island nations are on the forefront when it comes to issues caused by climate change. They're easily affected by sea level rise, unprotected against increasingly intense hurricanes, and with limited farmland available, they're deeply reliant on crumbling fisheries for subsistence and economic development. The Seychelles is an island nation made of more than 150 islands scattered in the deep blue waters of the Indian Ocean, roughly 800 miles east of the African continent. Like most isolated island chains, the Seychelles are covered in rare species found nowhere else in the world, each one highly adapted to their life in paradise. Giant Aldabra tortoises lumber across a co-evolved ecosystem called tortoise turf, plants that can survive the intense grazing pressures caused by 20,000 bathtub-sized tortoises per square mile. Dugongs, a critically endangered marine mammal that looks like a manatee, still call the waters of the Seychelles home. And thanks to a groundbreaking financial program pioneered by the Nature Conservancy, the government of the Seychelles has successfully protected 30% of their oceans for future generations. This week, we sit down with Melissa Garvey, director of the Nature Bonds program at the Nature Conservancy, to learn how they're solving one of the biggest problems in conservation. Who's signing the check?
Welcome to Conservation Connection, the show where we do just that. Each week, connect you to what's going on in the field of conservation. I'm Chance.
And I'm Sarah Catherine.
And we are so excited to be back into the regular rhythm of posting and interacting with y'all through the hotline and comments on Spotify and all sorts of good things.
We sure are. It's going to be an exciting season, I think. But before we get into that, Chance, I have a question for you.
Wow, right out the gate. Let's do it.
Yes. Not related to anything specific, but have you ever seen where people are like, if you were going to put pants on a dog, like if you were going to draw a picture of a dog with pants on it, how would you draw it? Like, would they just be on the back two legs? Would they be on the back and the front?
Yes, I am aware of the philosophical debate around this topic.
Okay, so dolphins and whales.
Sure.
Where would you put a necktie or a little scarf? Like, where does the head end?
Well, first off, I have to say it's all about hydrodynamics. They have to be able to move through the water. So I don't think they would wear a necktie or a scarf.
Well, okay.
But if they had a flair for fashion, I think it goes right under the chin. I think that's the defining characteristic.
The chin. But like, what would you consider the chin?
Imagine a dolphin spy hopping out of the water, coming up and looking at you at a 90-degree angle.
Okay, well, we're dolphin people, so we know what that means. But everybody doesn't know what that means. For me, I feel like it's right before the blowhole on a dolphin.
Before the blowhole? I would put it right after the blowhole.
I think so. I don't know. I mean, I guess if you just look at a dolphin skeleton, then you could see where the skull ends, and that would kind of solve this answer. But yeah, that was my question for you.
That is a doozy to start the season.
It is. Anyway, why don't you tell us what this episode is about?
Sure. So it's completely unrelated to dolphins and neckties, although it does talk about the ocean a fair amount.
That's fair.
For me, this episode really takes on the biggest question in conservation. Who's going to pay for all this, right?
The biggest question. I mean, I guess that's fair.
Right? That's my personal opinion on it, because you can draw up all these beautiful plans and have the scientific data to back things up. But until you have dollars, you can't make things happen out in the world. That's just how it is. So the Nature Bonds program through the Nature Conservancy is all about figuring out ways for a country to refinance their debt at a lower overall cost and turn that money into conservation projects. And they've done this successfully several times, and Melissa really gets into some of the cool stuff and outcomes that they've been able to achieve through the Nature Bonds program.
She was really a great communicator. And I mean, I think that's part of her job, right? Is communicating these hard to understand topics. And that's part of why we wanted to have her on the show at Sun Valley, because this is a topic that Chance and I are definitely not experts in. Finance is not our strong suit.
Which is hilarious because both of our siblings
work in finance.
Yeah. My brother's been in venture capital and private equity. Your brother works in banking. I don't know how that happened twice, that like there is a nature one and there's a finance one, sort of a yin and yang thing. But
if that's how it is in your family too, text us and let us know.
It might be more common than we realize.
It could be. I guess we'll see.
I loved how good Melissa is at explaining financial concepts in a way that somebody who spends their time in the woods can understand them.
Mm-hmm.
I think that she holds a really interesting role in that she has to be able to talk to scientists about finance and financiers about science and heads of state about both, and make sure that everybody's using the same language to achieve a common goal. And not just over like, hey, we want to do this single release of money to a project. It's like they're setting up 15 years of consistent funding towards the establishment of a marine protected area or looking at certain biodiversity goals and stuff like that. So it's like, it is some heavy hitting stuff.
It really is, but it is very engaging and there is lots of nature involved as well. So I think our audience will really enjoy this episode.
I was really curious to hear how somebody who is putting together these giant projects and sitting at a computer most of the time stayed connected to nature, because that's what she's working towards, but she doesn't get to be in it all day long. And I thought she had a really good answer to that.
Yeah, so look forward to that later in the episode.
As you're listening, if you want to reach out, ask us any questions, or look for some more information about what we're talking about, you can always reach us on the hotline. That phone number is 706-505-0582. Shoot us a text. I want to hear what you think.
And now let's get to the show. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. It's an honor to be here. I'm such a fan of what you do.
Oh, thank you. We really appreciate that.
It's funny because I think that we're in very similar work, us and you, because it's all about translating, right? It's connecting really complex ideas to people who need to understand those ideas.
Yeah, it's also about taking the ideas and, in my case, moving from what's a really important need in the world and actually having it land into results. But yeah, I spend a lot of time, what I call translating between the different genres of conservation finance, as well as some of the planning, as well as just being able to talk to our counterparts in places on the ground to see how we can best be able to connect the financing, the science, the planning, the policy to be able to deliver results for large-scale conservation and climate outcomes.
I'm really excited to get into this because I know basically nothing about conservation finance, but I know it is such an important piece of the puzzle, because the question is like, who's paying for this, right? Where's the money coming from to make these conservation efforts happen? And you are figuring out solutions to that are sustainable and long-term through the Nature Bonds program, right?
Thanks. I'm working on a narrow piece of the conservation finance world. We have all recognized that there's this incredible challenge of biodiversity loss that we're all experiencing, and we're also living through the climate crisis. At the same time, though, there's also a crisis with debt. And this is one area that I think a lot of us that are otherwise more focused on the conservation and climate space may not be as aware of. But there's an enormous financing gap that's making it difficult for developing countries to be able to make good on some of their ambitions for whether it's biodiversity protection or climate change. And, the numbers that we're hearing are that, there's a $700 billion financing gap for nature, and about 60% of low-income countries are either in debt distress or they're about to be facing it.
So at like the very lowest level, that means that there's a country that has either taken out loans, is that the right word?
Yeah, it's their sovereign debt, right? Like just like people, countries can take on debt to be able to, invest in the things that are important for the people and for their economies.
And so as they're developing, they simply don't have the money to repay that debt, right?
Yeah, or even as if they're not developing countries have a tremendous amount of debt too, right? In the U.S., we see that. So this is it's a common way of just being able to finance what a country needs to do. And many times what we're seeing is that lower income countries, especially those that are often, at the forefront of climate change, they're having to go into more and more debt as they're, for example, needing to rebuild after hurricanes, right? And those are the kinds of situations that make it difficult to be able to make good on some of the conservation and climate commitments. But look, the other challenge we have is interest rates are going up, right? So you have countries that may be in debt, they're needing to go into greater debt, and it's that much more difficult for them to be able to acquire new debt or to refinance the debt that they otherwise have, which is typically what countries do. You just sort of roll over that debt.
So I'm assuming this is kind of what you're working to help with nature bonds. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that is?
Sure. So the Nature Bonds program in its simplest form is we're working with countries to help them refinance their debt, their sovereign debt, and to use the cost savings to be able to put into really ambitious large-scale biodiversity protection or climate change. But in addition to the refinancing, we also add in technical assistance on science and planning and policy so that countries have the tools they need to be able to deliver those ambitious outcomes and be able to bridge that nature finance gap and also support local communities.
So if I were to sum that up, and you can absolutely tell me that I'm wrong, what I'm understanding is that what the Nature Bonds program is doing is if a country has sovereign debt, you're helping to restructure that debt in a way that it costs them less money over time. And then you're taking those savings and putting them into conservation efforts directly with technical assistance from scientists and other people who are going to make them more successful at the projects that they're trying to complete.
Yeah, you're a really quick study on this, so great job.
Yes.
I can sort of walk you through it a little bit. And there is a real technical term here. We're not doing debt restructuring, it's debt refinancing. And
okay.
There's sometimes negative implications to restructuring, and countries don't ever want to be identified as having to do restructuring when they're not. But at its simplest form, any of our nature bonds projects, we start with a transaction. And it's an agreement between the government where they're agreeing to take on really ambitious climate or conservation objectives. And in support of that, we will work with them to help them refinance their debt. So we are able to refinance that debt with lower interest rates and longer repayment periods because we're able to bring in partners like development banks or development finance institutions. So like the Inter-American Development Bank or the U.S. Development Finance Corporation, USDFC. And those entities provide what's called credit enhancement. Credit enhancement is like a political risk insurance or a guarantee, kind of like co-signing on that debt. And it takes the risk out of the debt, which then allows us to go to a standard commercial bank, whether it's UBS or Bank of America, and have a pretty safe bet for them to be able to take that and to work with investors and to issue new debt that's cheaper, and they can buy back the more expensive debt. Then the next step is to have all of the funds that are freed up from that debt refinancing and put that through a conservation trust fund that's independent from government, meaning government has representation on the board, but they don't actually control every aspect of the conservation trust fund. Now, the way that I often compare any of these, sovereign debt refinancings or try and explain it is it's a little bit like if you're a homeowner, if you're privileged enough to be a homeowner and you were thinking about refinancing your mortgage. Okay. Now, say you have a wealthy aunt with a great credit rating who can co-sign for you. And that would allow you to have much lower interest rates. And it might allow you to save some money that you might then invest to put solar panels on your roof. It's the same concept, a little more complicated with sovereign debt refinancing.
Right.
And we're dealing with countries as opposed to home mortgages, but it's a similar idea.
Yeah. Some of the stuff that you were saying, I was like, okay, I only know this because we own a house. And we've had to learn about that as we were becoming homeowners and everything. But something I really love that you mentioned earlier is that these countries and places aren't only just getting money and being like, okay, yeah, go do your thing, but you're bringing in experts to help them accomplish these things. It's just the difference of being like, okay, here's a topic, go figure it out. Or here's a topic and here's a mentor for you, essentially. And I think that's a really amazing piece of that puzzle.
And it makes a lot of sense because you're invested in the outcome, right? You're going through all of this work to free up funds for conservation. You want to make sure that those efforts are as successful as they can be.
Yeah, I think it's also important to understand that the refinancing transaction is really just step one. So step 2 is once the transaction has closed, everyone celebrates, right? And we all take a breath. We then need to make sure that that conservation trust fund gets set up if there wasn't one that we were already working with in the country. But we also go into the next phases on some conservation planning. And so in most of the projects that we've taken on, they've all been in the ocean space so far. So we would be working to help support and facilitate a marine spatial planning process on behalf of the government. So that's where a lot of the technical assistance can come in. So with any of the marine spatial planning efforts, you need to make sure that you're engaging with stakeholders. And as we're engaging in the terrestrial and freshwater spaces, it's even that much more important to think about, okay, who lives in these places? Are there rights holders that we need to make sure are at the table? Are there other interested parties, whether it's, say, the tourism industry or other natural resource users, that would want to have a say in either, the creation of new protected areas or just have a lot of data and information that's going to be important to get the planning right, but also that you want to make sure are really bought into those new protected areas or management plans or whatever some of those next steps are.
One of the really forward-thinking aspects of this program is how they're taking every stakeholder's needs into consideration. In one of the early projects, roughly half of the protected area was off-limits to all human activities except for non-extractive uses, stuff like ecotourism. But the other half was designated for sustainable economic activities like catch-and-release fishing charters and renewable energy generation. When a nation's economy relies on the ocean for nearly everything they have, programs that foster the sustainable use of marine resources strengthen their financial position and build a strong foundation for future generations.
So step 1 is the transaction, step 2 is the planning, and then you go into some of the implementation for these projects. And unlike what we often see in some conservation work, these are very long-term efforts because the implementation and the financial resources that are unlocked in a nature bonds project, it spans a 15 or 20-year timeline. It's the same timeline that the debt refinancing is on. There's annual funding that goes in through that conservation trust fund and then into implementation on the ground. So that's step 3. And then throughout the duration of all of these projects is really robust reporting that needs to happen. So that's reporting of the financial transaction, but also of any of the biodiversity or conservation outcomes that have been agreed to. And the reporting is just essential so that investors have confidence, so that those development bank partners, so that they can see the progress as well. And of course, it's important just for philanthropists and the public to understand that there's integrity to this work too.
With a process that is this complex, how are you deciding where you're implementing these programs? Like, how are you picking the countries or the particular biodiversity loss issues that you want to target?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, we have a really robust process for us to identify a couple of the key factors that are necessary for us to be able to have a successful nature bonds project. The first one is they have to have debt that we can work with to refinance, right?
That's a step 1, like base level thing.
Yeah, and there's a lot of countries that may have significant debt, but it's bilateral debt. So debt that's lent from one government to another versus debt that's what we call commercial debt or debt from a bank. We can really only work with commercial debt in these projects. You may have heard of debt swaps in the past. So that's often the forgiveness of bilateral debt or debt between governments. We're not working in that space. We cheer that on. It's phenomenal, but this is a bit of a different space.
So that's like the U.S. owes this much money to Mexico. Mexico owes this much money to the U.S. And we're like, hey, let's just write those off the table.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there's some very powerful policy work in that space. Like I said, we cheer that on and we're excited to see when those possibilities happen. But this is different. And I think it's maybe important to understand the scale of the debt refinancing that's using commercial debt can be much larger than what you see in the bilateral debt space in most cases.
Which is very funny to me because it feels like countries would have access to much larger financial instruments than the commercial industry, but I guess that's not the case.
Well, there might be a lot of bilateral debt that's out there, but there's often less will to actually do the forgiveness.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, because it's a government basically saying you don't have to repay us at all, right? I mean, it's a little bit different than sort of the leverage that we're able to do in the commercial debt space.
So how did this program start, and kind of what are the early success stories that we've seen with it?
Sure. So the inception of this program started in the marine space because we were seeing that a lot of coastal and island countries were facing more and more storm damage from climate change induced storms and incurring more and more debt and having the inability to be able to invest in some of the resilience efforts that were important for them. So we pioneered this effort in the Seychelles and closed the first transaction in 2016. And we're really excited about how that project has come together. Over the past number of years, we've been able to do a robust marine spatial planning process, and we're sort of at the tail end of getting some of the conservation objectives implemented through that project. So you're going to see us be celebrating that a lot. The people of Seychelles and government of Seychelles have just made unbelievable progress. You know, they now have commitments in protected areas that are about the size of Germany.
Wow.
It's phenomenal, and a place that's so important from a biodiversity standpoint that it's something we should all be celebrating. They were absolute pioneers to take this on, and we're just so proud of our that we've been able to work with them on their journey and seeing these outcomes be put in place.
So with this early success with the Seychelles and kind of being at the tail end, and I'm sure you're feeling very celebratory about it and very happy with it, what are some of the next places that you're looking to target?
Yeah, well, let me give you a little bit of other history. So we had our first pilot project in Seychelles, and then shortly after that, in 2019, we actually won the TED Audacious competition for this being one of the big ideas of our time.
That's amazing.
We got some initial seed funding to be able to just scale up. And so we were able to put that to work, right as the pandemic hit. And countries were seeing new challenges, economic challenges, right? So our next project was in Belize. And so Belize was at that point really struggling because they have such a tourism-based economy. And their debt levels had skyrocketed. They didn't have the revenue to be able to pay back some debt that was coming due. So we were able to work with them in 2021, closed a transaction where we refinanced, it was about $550 million in debt. We were able to buy it at a discount because they were technically in default. And that allowed us to be able to unlock a lot of funding. And so that project generates about $180 million in financing over the term of the project. And the government in Belize, much like the government in Seychelles, had committed to protecting 30% of their ocean. And they also had committed to putting in place some new regulatory measures for fisheries management, as well as a regulatory framework for blue carbon. So really ambitious goals that Belize is wanting to make good on, and this project is helping them finance that. Fast forward another year, we closed a transaction in Barbados, where we worked with that country to be able to unlock about $50 million for conservation. And they also committed to protecting 30% of their ocean. And it was such a thrill to work on that project. A country that's being led by one of the world's heroes in the climate space. Prime Minister Mia Mottley is one of my sheroes. So having that be able to get to transaction close and, now move into its next steps was such a thrill. And then fast forward again, another year in Gabon, we closed another large scale refinancing, and that project is generating, it's about $160 million for marine conservation activities. Again, they committed to protecting 30% of their ocean, and it's building on some great work that had previously been done by WCS in the country on some of the prior marine spatial planning that they had put in place, bringing refinancing dollars in support of those existing marine spatial planning efforts and doing some additional planning on top of that. And now in 2024, we're going to be rolling out the first couple of projects that we have, expanding from not just working in the marine biome, but now engaging also in terrestrial freshwater and climate outcomes. So I can't talk about the projects just yet because they're confidential, but we're excited to be able to share those when the transactions do close.
This new consideration for terrestrial projects is actually what prompted the Nature Conservancy to rename this program. Originally, this launched as the Blue Bonds Program in 2016 when it was more heavily focused on ocean conservation and marine spatial planning. But last year, in 2023, they officially launched its current iteration, the Nature Bonds Program. And if this sounds familiar, you probably remember us talking about it last season during our conversation with Dr. Jennifer McGowan, a decision scientist who helps governments use the vast amount of data at their disposal to make the best possible decisions for the planet. If you want to learn more, check out our Season 10 episode called Are We Drowning in Data?
You had asked me about what are the ways in which we choose our projects. So initially when we started, as I mentioned, we were focused just on ocean projects and looking for where there were some biodiversity wins there, but also matching that with countries that had available debt for us to work with. The key next thing that we always look for, not just the biodiversity opportunity and not just the debt availability, but it's essential that you have a government that wants to do one of these projects. So that government willingness is something that we track and certainly encourage wherever those opportunities are, because you can't work with a country that's not interested in one of these projects. And so we're spending a lot of time just sharing information about these projects, the benefits of them, but also seeing where we can have some of the leaders in the countries that we're working with talk with their peers who may be, presidents, or having a minister of environment or minister of finance talk to their counterpart in another country.
Be like, hey, this worked really well for us. Maybe you guys should consider it for the issues that you're dealing with.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That was actually one of my questions, was like, it seems like this amazing thing that you're doing. And so I was going to ask, are countries just like, yes, we want to do it? Or do you have trouble sometimes being like, no, this is a really good thing, and countries are like, no, thanks?
I'd say it's a mix. There's often a fair amount of enthusiasm and also not always the clear sense of what these projects are, for good reason. I mean, these are sort of new concepts that we're working with. And I think occasionally you get a country that's rather excited, but if we're talking with the Minister of Environment, they maybe haven't checked in with the Minister of Finance, who's like, yeah, we don't really have the right kind of debt to do this project. So sometimes it's just talking with two different arms of government, making sure that they're talking together and that we're using the same information. Because there's a lot of countries that are maybe really excited to use this approach, but it might not be the right fit. So, I think the other thing that we're seeing is that there's interest in using these kinds of approaches, not just in the nature and climate sectors, but others as well. And so, we're working to do two things. One is to make sure that there's really high standards for any of these projects that are trying to use debt refinancing for nature and climate. And the idea is that we want to make sure that investors have real confidence in any of these nature projects, so that they can be sort of the first thing that people think about, that investors think about, and that they've got a really clear sense of what they're signing up, sort of what they would be investing in. So we want them to have like really high integrity projects that they're able to support. And so the work that we're doing right now is engaging with a number of other NGOs, as well as our counterparts at the development banks and USDFC, working with investors to come up with a set of standards that we can all agree to, that's going to be what good looks like for these kinds of projects. So that matters a lot. And sort of part and parcel of that, we've also developed a toolkit. Mm-hmm. And the toolkit is kind of like a how-to manual for how you would do a nature bonds project. And we're able to use that to share with governments so that they can understand at least sort of the big picture, how everything comes together. It's 80 pages that to somebody who's not in this space might be a little boring, but for those of us who are involved in this space, or if you're involved in one of these projects, you may have a narrow sense of, say, the financing, but to get a sense also of all the conservation work that needs to happen, or what the reporting needs to look like, having that all in one manual is really, really helpful, and can at least give governments a bit more of an understanding of what their engagement is, what their time commitment and capacity would need to be able to see a project be successful. So that's been really powerful, and we're thrilled to share that.
Yeah.
It's on our website, the Nature Bonds Toolkit, and it's in multiple languages at this point. So happy to point people in that direction.
I love to think that there might be a minister of finance somewhere that's listening to the show that's like, oh, this seems like a great idea.
Let me go look.
Yeah. Well, sometimes it's not even just a minister of finance that might be listening, but somebody who works with the minister of finance, or somebody who works with the minister of environment, who can be influential and say, you know what, this might be something to consider. It might work. Take a look.
Yeah, definitely worth at least browsing through. When we're talking about kind of these big ideas in conservation and these really high impact stories, I think sometimes it's easy to feel like I've lost sight a little bit of like the experience of standing in nature. And, so how are you personally balancing working with banks at the highest level and still being a nature lover and making time to be in nature?
That is such a great question. Well, I do a lot of travel, right? So showing up at conferences like here in Sun Valley or meeting with high government officials in places. And I always try and balance that with always bringing my running shoes. So I do my best to try and get out in nature, to take that run, to see what it's like, to talk with people on the ground in the places that I'm going to. And the experience for me has been like really just essential to have it be sort of this visceral connection between the nature at the very, very, sort of like nitty gritty sand in my shoes and all over all my suitcases, as well as being able to sit in that meeting room with a head of state. And it keeps me really grounded to be able to do that. And I also get inspired. So I was in Gabon before we were able to close that transaction and able to see elephants on the beach that I was running on. And such an unusual experience, number one, to have elephants on a beach.
That would be crazy.
It was, but, and also saw where there were nesting sea turtles. Again, it was really hot. So I got to jump in the ocean as I was finishing my run. But, all to say like that was starting to just sort of keep it real for me and balance out what are some of the other best days that I ever have, quote unquote, in the office, where I once got to meet my Shiro. So Prime Minister Mia Mottley is just a phenomenal world leader in climate. I don't know if you or some of your audience members are familiar with her. She's a head of state in a small island country that was facing serious debt issues, but also is at the forefront of climate change. And we were able to close a transaction with her and magically had the chance to meet with her on the same day that we closed the transaction. It was happening during New York Climate Week. It, I think, was probably the best day of my career outside of being able to see elephants on the beach, where I was at a small event and I was told that she would likely be there. And as she walked in the room, I heard her talking about the Nature Bonds project. We called it a Blue Bonds project for Barbados. And I introduced myself because we hadn't met. We had been working with some of the great, technical level people in the country, which was phenomenal. But when she walked in, I introduced myself as being, the lead for this program and working at the Nature Conservancy. She gave me a bear hug.
Oh.
And I can't even tell you how much my heart nearly exploded. And I was just so proud that I almost cried. I was so proud of what my team had been able to put together in support of the country in Barbados and help them achieve their goals. And so I asked her, I said, Prime Minister Mottley, would you do me the honor of letting me take a selfie? And I handed my camera to a colleague so we would even get a good view. And she has this booming voice. She says, "You take a selfie." She says, "I want a selfie."
Oh.
So I have a picture of, my Shiro taking a selfie with me, which
That's
again,
amazing.
just sort of made my day. So, when I talk about sort of, how to stay grounded with my shoes and my muddy shoes that are in my suitcase, like seeing the balance of those two experiences for me is really important, to both have the inspiration and seeing that in some of the political leaders that are really making a huge difference in our world, as well as just having some of the day-to-day experiences, on the ground, meeting with people. Another sort of counterpart was being able to be in Belize and meet with some women that were part of a seaweed farming cooperative who are dependent on the healthy ocean, right? So again, like those kinds of experiences with people on the ground that benefit from these projects, that it really, that fills my heart in the same way on a sort of different kind of spectrum as meeting with the Prime Minister.
Really what it is it's keeping what you're fighting for present in your mind. It's what makes writing an 80-page technical document about like, hey, here's some things to think about. It's what makes it doable. It makes it sustainable for you to do this as your career. For how long have you been with the Nature Conservancy?
Don't make me say my age. No, I've been at the Nature Conservancy for 18 years paid, and a year before that as a volunteer. So yeah, I mean, it's always important to, stay centered in what we're doing, meet the people on the ground that are really the heroes for the work. It's how everything gets done. Mm-hmm. But all to say, I think that there's so many opportunities that lay ahead in this space because the world is changing so fast. The needs for addressing climate change and biodiversity protection are so vast, and the solutions that we're creating to be able to address them, what's going to happen in 3 to 5 years, we don't know what those positions are. And so for me, it's a really dynamic space and an exciting one to be engaged in and to have a career.
Mm-hmm. That's something we love to kind of echo on the show pretty often is there's a space for anyone in this field of like protecting the planet, right? It doesn't matter if you love finance, you love crunching numbers, you're a scientist and like in the field all the time, or you're just like, no, I just want to be in my office. Like there is a space for everyone to do something and to make an impact.
I'm so glad you said that, Sarah. I get hit up for career advice. I don't know whether I give good advice or not, but the advice that I do share is exactly what you said, which is that there's a space for everyone. Again, like we can't imagine what the jobs are going to be in 3 years or 5 years. I mean, often I'm putting out a job description for something I couldn't have imagined 5 years ago, right? And I'm leading the space. And I think that's, to me, again, that's exciting. It's sort of a mosaic of different kinds of expertise that are just essential. Like we couldn't do the work unless we had all of these different kinds of really smart people at the table. And that goes back to what we had talked about before, which was the need to be sort of translating between the finance and the science and some of the policy, because each of us comes to this work with a bit of a different background. And I think occasionally things get lost in translation as we're using our mindsets and sort of the siloed thinking we have and needing to be able to add in concepts of, say, conservation planning into a transaction that's otherwise looks like it's a debt refinancing, right? So we need to make sure that we're bridging some of these different areas and kind of thinking differently and communicating in a way that might be something that we'd never considered before. There's a lot of light bulb moments.
So as somebody who has spent an incredible amount of time working in this space and leading this space, where did it all start for you?
I wish I could say there was just one moment, but I think for me, it's just so many different moments. I grew up in Indiana, and I had a connection to the land. My grandfather had a farm. And so, every single weekend, all summer in particular, we would be there with our feet in the dirt, helping on the farm. And it just was kind of natural to just be outside and have that be part of me. And then, later it became something I did for recreation and for my own, frankly, just sanity, is to get out and run or ride a bike. Certainly when I was practicing law, I felt like I needed that balance. And I think making the transition to work in the Nature Conservancy was bringing everything full cycle, which is where I realized that I had the ability to have what I did on a daily basis that, gosh, people would pay me to do. Also really filled my heart by knowing that the places that I cared about were going to be able to persist long into the future. And for me, again, it's just sort of a full cycle set of fulfillment that I didn't even know that I could have in my career, as well as, something that is just, very personally gratifying to me.
Mm-hmm. Having been in this field for a while and seeing the changes that you've seen, what gives you hope that we're headed in the right direction?
What gives me hope that we're headed in the right direction is what I see as sort of this constant innovation to be able to take these massive challenges that we have in front of us with biodiversity loss and the challenges that we see with climate change, and to come up with new solutions that hopefully can be making a dent. And I don't think that there's any single effort that is going to fix climate change, right? It's going to take all of us. Now, the work that we're doing with the Nature Bonds program, it's not a panacea, but I do think we can generate 2 billion or possibly $3 billion for conservation and climate outcomes over the term of these projects. We're going to be able to get those commitments in place over the next 5 years. I have no doubt. And yes, I'm ambitious, but I also know the projects that are in the hopper. What gives me hope is seeing that these things are possible, and they're possible because we're just thinking differently. And there's so many other people that are also making those choices, seeing the connections, and taking what seem to be unusual approaches like sovereign debt refinancing and tying it to these things that the world needs to be able to address: climate change and biodiversity loss.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you so much for being on the show with us today. This has been a really inspiring conversation in a space that I'm very unfamiliar with. And I just really appreciate your expertise and your ability to explain things.
Well, thanks. It's been such an honor to be with you here. I love your podcast, and I'm just so excited to share more with others about what you do.
Thank you so much. So I'll just start with saying it is now my dream to run on a beach with elephants. I don't even run, but...
I was going to say, that's saying a lot because you hate running.
I do hate running. I'm more inclined... I would be more inclined to do anything on a beach, but definitely if there's elephants. I mean, I guess I could just go on a walk.
I was going to say, do you want to just like drag a rowing machine out onto the beach? Because that's like your preferred workout. I want to be an elephant on the beach while people are running.
What? I don't even know where to go with that.
I mean, don't you think that'd be magical? Like you're there enjoying the
You're
waves.
an elephant, just being an elephant.
Yeah, I think that'd be a great time.
And you see a human run by and you're like, wow, look at that. Why are they running?
Yeah, what are they running from? But your giant elephant ears can tell you that there's no danger around?
Yeah.
I think that'd be nice.
Yeah, sounds great. Just go for a little elephant swim.
An elephant swim? That's adorable. They're actually really good swimmers. There's really cool information out about like elephants show up on a lot of isolated islands, like offshore stuff, and then become dwarfs. That's happened at least once in evolutionary history, and I feel pretty confident it's happened a couple of times.
Interesting.
Yeah, they're really good swimmers. Turns out you can find them on islands.
All elephants?
Like, I guess pachyderms is a group? I don't really know.
Well, maybe we'll answer that one day when we talk to an elephant scientist.
I'm really hoping to get some more like large animal conservationists on the show because they're just always cool stories being out in the field.
Yeah, maybe we'll just go work with the zoo. Have like a little giraffe scientist, a little elephant scientist.
If you work at a zoo and want to bring us in for a season, give me a call. Text the hotline, 706-505-0582.
Mm-hmm. One of the other things that I thought was a really timely point that Melissa brought up was how countries and places on the front lines of climate disaster tend to have the most debt, right? Because you're getting things like hurricanes, sea level rise, things are getting destroyed, and you're constantly having to rebuild them, which is so timely with the hurricane that we just saw, Helene, and then now
Milton coming in and just going to crush the middle section of Florida.
Yeah, well, hopefully not crush, but if you've been watching the weather, then you know that it's not looking great. We have lots of friends down there, and I know that we have plenty of listeners down there as well. So we hope you're all staying safe and that things aren't as bad as they look like they may be.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And you're right. It's really a timely conversation to be having that coastal communities are at the front lines of issues caused by climate change, whether that's sea level rise, intensifying storms, etc. It's places that really need to be forward thinking, like they're doing with the Nature Bonds program. And it's also really cool to hear stories about governments that are so willing to do these weird, innovative financial practices in order to make stuff like this happen.
Yeah, I thought that was cool too, because I feel like a lot of the times what you see is a lot of negative interactions between government and the environment, and that's not necessarily the case in this story, which I thought was really great to hear.
Yeah, always good to find those spotlights of success out there.
Definitely.
So, Sarah Catherine, what do we have coming down the pipe next week?
Next week on the show, we'll have Benjamin von Wong, who's an artist and an activist, and I think will really resonate with a lot of our audience. He just has so many cool stories to tell and so many examples of impactful artwork that he's created. And that's just kind of this niche that he's fallen into and what's been successful for him and what he's passionate about. And he has lots of cool things coming up. So this will be a great time for you to hear from him next week.
And he's so thoughtful, too. It's rare nowadays, I feel like, to ask somebody a question and have them pause and consider before they give you an answer. And he was really, really intentional about like thinking through his answers before he gave them, which I thought was really cool.
Yeah, he was a blast to meet and get to know and have on the show at Sun Valley. Speaking of Sun Valley, a huge thank you to the Sun Valley Forum for bringing us out this year and giving us the opportunity to record this season of our episodes for all of our listeners. We had a blast being there, and we hope that you have a blast listening.
If you'd like to find out more about Melissa Garvey's work with the Nature Conservancy and the Nature Bonds program, scroll down to the show notes. I've got some links right there for you guys to go learn more about their success stories. And if you love the show and you want to support us, you can also find our link to our website in the show notes. You can go check out our merch store, get some really cool shirts, some cups, or even just donate to help support the show.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.